Lighting is one of the most important factors when it comes to filmmaking. But what if you're in a situation where you have very little light available or no light at all?
The sun sets at like 5 p.m, so what better time to practice low light videography than now? In this video, we're gonna go through all of the settings to use for your S5 Mark II. I'm talking ISO, aperture, shutter speed, as well as what lenses are best for clean shots and what environments you should place yourself in to get some really great shots in low light videography.
The first thing we want to address is what settings you're using. Controlling the brightness of your image comes down to a few settings. This is your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Starting with your ISO, the S5 Mark II has a dual native ISO. So what's a native ISO? A native ISO is the ISO at which your camera shoots the best possible image. It has the most dynamic range, the most latitude, and it will just get the best result there compared to shooting at a different ISO. Is it really that big of a difference? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, it kind of depends. Some cameras like the S5 Mark II have two of these, which really does come in handy when it comes to shooting in low light situations. So for the S5 Mark II, the native ISOs are 800 and 4000. What this means is even when you're in low light, when you switch to 4000 ISO, your image will be perfectly clean, even though at 3200 there may have been some noise in the shot. This can get pretty sciencey and I don't fully understand it, but in all honesty, that's all you need to know. So since we're going to be shooting out in the dark, we're going to start by using the second native ISO of 4000. Next up is aperture. The aperture is the opening in your lens that 1 controls how much light comes in and hits your camera sensor, and 2 controls to what degree things in your shot are in focus. Shooting at a lower f-stop means more light will come in, but less things will be in focus, and vice versa, shooting with a higher f-stop means that less light will come in and hit your sensor, but more things are in focus in your shot. Now, what f-stop you choose to use is ultimately up to you because it depends to what degree you want things in focus within your shot, but if your shot is looking a bit dark, opening up the f-stop and lowering it is a good way to let in more light, thus having a brighter image. A good lens to grab is anything from like an f1.8 or lower. An f2.8 lens can work as well, it's just that your shots may be a little bit dark. I would not recommend anything higher than f2.8, f3.5 and above. There's just not enough light coming in and it becomes quite hard to shoot in a low light situation, but it's not impossible. Lastly, we have shutter speed or shutter angle if some of you have that setting turned on for the S5 Mark II, which I do. This can be a bit tricky, especially if you want to shoot slow motion in the dark, because, well, for those of you who don't know, the 180-degree shutter rule, your shutter speed needs to be double your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 25 frames per second, which is the standard here in the UK, or 24 for my American friends, then your shutter speed needs to be 1/50. So if you want to shoot 50 frames per second, or 60 frames per second, or 100 frames per second, or 120 frames per second, it has to be double that. And it just means that you're just letting in less and less light, which means it becomes harder to do anything in slow motion if there is no light to shoot it with. Now, whilst I don't want to say that anything is impossible, it will probably be very difficult to achieve a good looking slow motion shot at 120 frames per second. Maybe you can get away with doing 50 frames per second if you're in well-lit areas, but I think if you want to push it any further than that, it's going to be kind of difficult. All of that said, you can actually choose to lower your shutter speed. Be careful how much you decrease your shutter speed by, because if you decrease it too much, you'll introduce too much motion blur and then the shot just won't be clear. Controlling all of these settings will give you a good balance between focus, exposure, and motion blur. Next up, we're looking at lenses. Now, you guys probably know this already, but Panasonic has created this awesome prime lens lineup that is all f1.8, except the new 100mm, that's an f2.8. You can basically say the entire range is f1.8, super low light friendly, and these are great options because for one, they're budget friendly, and I've actually gone over the 18mm in another video that you can click on after finishing this video, link in the description, and it's a great lens. The 50mm is also f1.8, so is the 85, the 35, the 24. The main point here is that they're all boasting a low aperture, which means you have the capabilities of letting in a lot more light than say a kit lens that is stuck at f3.5 as the lowest. I personally own the 18 and 50mm. They're both f1.8, which is great. If you can get something that's even lower than that, like an f1.4, an f1.2, or even go crazy and get one of those f0.95 lenses, you will be able to let in a lot more light. It's incremental, but sometimes that small increment can make a big difference. Now, let's see what sort of lighting situations are most ideal when it comes to shooting in low light. Put yourself in an area with a lot of light.
I know it sounds contradicting because, well, we're doing low light stuff, but if you can, find a place with a lot of light because this is going to give you the best chance to have a cleaner image. Things like street lights, car headlights, street signs that are lit up, anything that is really bright, these will give you a better chance of having a cleaner shot in low light, and you have generally a better chance of finding those areas in cities.
Now, what do you do when you're in the worst kind of situation possible? There's no light, or like literally next to no light, because if you're recording in pitch black, then why are you doing that? But let's say you're recording a super low light situation. What do you do? Well, I have a couple of tips here. Tip number one, don't use log. And now I'll be the first to say I love log. I use it for everything, even shooting in the dark sometimes, which is, you know, can be counterproductive. Log is great because it was made to capture more dynamic range than what your camera is capable of when you're recording in the Rec 709 picture profile, which is what we all grade our final videos to anyway. You can see further into the highlights and further into the shadows and have a great balance of the two, so you can kind of see closer to what our human eyes see, right? But if we're in a situation where there isn't a large amount of dynamic range because there isn't a lot of light, then it's counterproductive to be shooting in log because we'll just be introducing noise into the shadows. Because once the noise is in the shadows, it's in the shadows, it's baked in. If you do want to shoot in log though, then make sure you expose for your shadows as much as possible. When you expose for your shadows, it means your highlights might be a little bit, not blown, but quite hot, right? They're almost blown out. But beauty of log is that you can pull things back and recover information. Now, when you pull everything back, having exposed for the shadows, you should theoretically have cleaner shadows, at least maybe there's very little noise. Hopefully there's no noise, but this all depends on the situation. Because if we have no light at all, the dimmest of street lights, just nothing, then shooting in log probably doesn't make a lot of sense. And now tip number two, if you're in that situation where you're cranking up the ISO, the image is getting noisy and there's not much you can do about it, and you really need to film this shot for some reason, then embrace the noise. There are two types of noise, luminance noise and color noise. Color noise is the ugly one that nobody wants. It's what makes your image look muddy and colors start to shift into other colors and they just don't look right. It's not great. Luminance noise, however, can be mildly aesthetic. It can be kind of thought as film grain in a way. It's not, but it's not as ugly, so it's a bit more acceptable. What I personally like to do if I have to shoot something in ultra low light is to lean into the dark and gritty look. Look, if you're wanting to shoot something that's all happy and bright, you're better off doing it during the day. If you want something that's shot at night, then leaning into a dark and grittier look can actually be helpful because you can do that easily in post, and you can push it even further by adding things like film grain so it looks like the noise is a bit more purposeful. And on top of that, if you unfortunately have some color noise in your shot and things are just looking quite messy, a good trick is to turn your image into black and white in post. Then there's no color noise because there's no color, so it just looks like luminance noise. And then if you add film grain, it looks like it's just a stylized look. Filmmakers will know you're cheating because I've always noticed it, but the general public will be like, oh, that's a nice black and white image right there. And you'll be like, fully intentional. Low light videography is a fun challenge. You're limited on light, so you need to get creative on what you shoot and where you shoot it, and try to make the most of very little. Or like I said, just embrace the darkness. And of course, having your gear set up and ready to tackle the darkness with the correct ISO settings, the correct shutter speed settings, and a fast lens will make this all so much easier. Hopefully you feel ready to tackle low light videography with your S5 Mark II. And if you have any additional questions, just pop them in the comments below because I make sure to reply to everybody. And I'm really appreciating the engagement and the new subscribers and the new viewers. Seriously, it's awesome because I do want to make this my career. So thank you guys. I'm really appreciating the feedback and the interaction, everything. It's great. And speaking of low light videography, if you're wondering how this little guy, the Ace Pro, does in low light, then check out this video here. Don't forget to subscribe. See you there.